The anemometer froze at 2017. It didn't seize the way they usually do. No jitter, no gradual slowdown. It just stopped reporting. Wind was still moving hard enough to scour spindrift off the ridge crest, but the cups held a single position like they'd been pinned. That's not ice. Ice lies about resistance before it commits. This was silence in the signal, not failure in the hardware. I stayed in the bunk and listened instead of getting up. The hut creaks differently when the wind is real. Pressure flexes the seams, sets up a rhythm you can feel through the mattress frame. That rhythm was there. The storm system hadn't collapsed. Only the readout had. I logged it mentally and waited until first light. Nothing else was wrong yet, which is how problems start up here. One indicator out of step, everything else pretending not to notice. Morning routine stayed narrow. I cracked the door just long enough to dump yesterday's ash and check the fuel drums. No new frost lines on the hoses. No diesel smell. Good. I knocked rime off the antenna mast with the handle of the snow rake, careful not to ring it. Metal sound carries too far in cold air. The binoculars came out once the sun cleared the far shoulder of the range and flattened the valley haze. The valley stayed dark except for that one place. The cluster sat low, near the river bend where the old substation feeds the east side. It hadn't been lit when the rest went out. That mattered. If someone had brought a generator online, you'd see irregularity flicker, uneven spread, gaps where loads drop. This had been steady and geometric. Too clean. It came on, held, then went dark again like it was testing load and backing off. Smoke confirmed it wasn't a fluke. Thin, gray, rising straight before it broke in the upper wind. Not a burn pile. Not a house fire. It was controlled heat, brief enough not to draw the dead, long enough to mean work was being done. I stayed on the ridge because elevation buys time. Sound travels clean, but it also arrives early. Anything moving uphill has to pay for every meter with effort and exposure. Down there, effort is hidden by walls. Up here, it's written in silhouette and breath. By midday, the anemometer was still dead, but the antenna picked up a burst of static it shouldn't have. Short. Directional. Like someone keyed a transmitter without finishing the thought. I didn't answer. Answers create correspondence. I kept the engine cold. Fuel gelled the way it should. The plow truck is my shelter and my liability. Turn it over at the wrong time and the sound carries into the valley like a signature. I checked the exhaust by hand instead, feeling for warmth that would tell me something was wrong inside. Nothing. Late afternoon, the wind shifted downslope without the usual temperature drop. Cold air should have drained hard into the valley by then. Instead, it stalled at the ridge edge like something was pushing back. Inversions do that sometimes, but not cleanly. Clean stalls mean structure below is warming unevenly. When night fell, I watched the valley through glass and didn't cook. Hunger is quieter than curiosity. Around 21,040 the same cluster flickered again, 30 seconds this time, long enough to confirm phase alignment, short enough to stay invisible unless you were looking for it. Someone down there was waking pieces of the grid deliberately. If they succeed, the valley becomes loud again. Lights draw people, people draw the dead, noise climbs. Eventually it reaches the pass. The ridge doesn't keep you safe forever, it just delays consequence. Staying up here works as long as the valley stays broken. Tonight it tried not to be. I woke before the light because the cold changed texture. Not colder, sharper. The kind that bites through layers and makes metal sound brittle when you touch it. That usually means clear air and stable pressure. But the ridge felt unsettled, like the wind couldn't decide which way it wanted to drain. The anemometer was still frozen. I climbed the mast far enough to see the cups against the sky, and confirmed what I already knew. No ice load, no mechanical jam. The vane had rotated overnight, responding to shifts, but the cups stayed locked. Power was reaching the unit. Power was reaching the unit. That's a sensor failure mode I've only seen when the signal path is interrupted downstream. The instrument was working. Something between it and the display wasn't. I didn't troubleshoot further. Troubleshooting assumes a closed system. This one wasn't. I spent the early hours on glass. Binoculars steady, elbows braced, breathing slow. The valley looked the same at first. Dark shapes where neighborhoods used to be defined by light. Then I noticed a second anomaly. Not illumination. Alignment. A stretch of road near the river bend had been cleared. Not fully, but enough to show a pale line where frost should have been uniform. That doesn't happen by accident. Plows leave signatures you can read days later if you know what to look for. This wasn't a plow. No windrow, no edge feathering. It was clear just enough for tires to pass without losing traction. Someone was moving at night. The smoke came back mid-morning, this time lower and dirtier. Shorter burn. Different source. That suggests testing redundancy. Bring one system online, shut it down, bring another up. You do that when you're trying to map what still works without committing resources. I logged fuel next. Drums were steady, but the line feeding the truck had started to thicken. Not gelled yet, but trending. I wrapped it and adjusted my melt schedule to account for the extra cold. Cooking would wait another day. The engine stayed cold. Always. Sound carried far in the afternoon. I heard a rock fall 3 ridges over and counted the seconds until it reached me. Long enough to mean distance. Short enough to mean clarity. Cold air strips lies out of sound. If anything started climbing, I'd hear it before it crested the tree line. Late afternoon brought the first change I didn't like. A faint mechanical note from the valley, almost below hearing. Not an engine, more like a transformer under partial load. It came and went twice, each time lasting less than a minute. That lines up with the flickers I'd seen. Someone was loading circuits cautiously, backing off when tolerances were hit. That's competent work. Competent work draws attention from people who know what it means. If the grid comes back in pieces, survivors will move toward it. So will anyone else still organized enough to exploit it? The dead will follow later, drawn by sound and light like always. The ridge will stay quiet longer than the valley, but not forever. At dusk, I checked the antenna again and caught another static burst. Same direction, same duration. Someone was talking to the mountain, even if they didn't know it. Signals bounce strangely up here. You can wake things without realizing who's listening. I stayed dark and watched the valley until full night. No flicker this time. No smoke. That's not comfort. That's consolidation. You don't test forever. Eventually you either commit or move on. The decision pressure settled in quietly. Staying on the ridge means betting that whoever is rebuilding below fails or gets overwhelmed before the consequences climb. Going down means trading elevation and warning time for information and options I don't currently have. I've lived my whole working life delaying storms, pushing snow back just enough to keep the road open one more night. This feels the same. The ridge is a delay, not a solution. By the end of part 2, the cost of waiting was clear, even if I didn't name it. If the valley stabilizes, I lose separation. If it destabilizes violently, I lose escape routes. Either way, the window where elevation equals safety is narrowing. I logged the anomalies, sealed the hut tighter against sound, and waited through the long blue hour when the cold sharpens and every mistake carries. Tomorrow, I'll have to decide whether to stay above the inversion or step into whatever is trying to wake the valley back up. The wind finally committed just before dawn, draining downslope the way it should have hours earlier. When it did, the hut relaxed. You feel it before you hear it, pressure equalizing, seams settling back into their familiar complaints. That told me the inversion had broken overnight. Whatever warmth had been pooling in the valley had either dissipated or been shut down deliberately. The anemometer stayed dead. I climbed the mast again, this time carrying the handheld gauge I keep as a sanity check. Old school, no data link, just cups and a needle. It spun clean in the wind and read steady. I didn't bother bringing it back inside. I mounted it next to the frozen sensor and left them both exposed. Redundancy only matters if it's independent. Right now, the problem wasn't wind. It was reporting. Morning glass showed more changes. The cleared stretch of road had extended overnight, not far, but enough to confirm intent. No tracks leading off it. Whoever did the work cleaned just enough to move and then vanished back into shadow. That kind of discipline costs energy and planning. You don't do it unless you expect to use the route again. I logged fuel consumption and realized I was burning less than expected. Cold does that when you stop moving. That's good for storage and bad for circulation. I forced myself to shovel a short wind drift off the hut's lee side just to get blood moving. I erased the work carefully afterward, letting Spindrift refill the cut so it wouldn't read as activity from a distance. Around mid-morning, the valley flickered again. Different cluster this time. Smaller. higher up the slope, closer to the old relay station that used to feed the pass lights. That location mattered. It meant whoever was working wasn't just restoring neighborhoods. They were testing vertical reach. That puts me on the board whether I want to be or not. I stayed on glass through most of the day, tracking smoke, shadow, and movement. I saw none of the dead moving toward the light yet. Either the tests were too brief to draw them, or someone below was managing sound carefully. You can run power quietly if you know how. I've done it during blizzards to keep signal boxes alive without drawing attention from stranded drivers. The realization landed heavier than the cold. The people below weren't panicking. They were working a plan. Late afternoon, I heard something new. Faint. Rhythmic. Coming up the access road that snakes toward the pass before dying out in drifts. It wasn't an engine. It was impact. Metal on frozen ground at regular intervals. Someone walking with tools, striking ice deliberately or accidentally. The sound didn't climb far, but it didn't need to. It told me the valley wasn't just waking systems. It was exporting effort upslope. I stayed inside and killed even passive noise. No stove, no movement. The hut became just another frozen scar on the ridge. Through the wall, I felt the impacts fade and stop well below the last switchback. Whoever it was didn't climb all the way. That was either caution or lack of capacity. As night came on, clouds rolled in fast from the west, flattening starlight and trapping sound. Bad conditions for observation. Good conditions for movement. I checked the truck one last time, hands numb on the hood, feeling for vibration that shouldn't be there. Nothing. The anemometer display blinked once as I turned away. Just a single refresh, then flatlined again. That wasn't random. Someone, somewhere below, was sending pulses through systems that still touched the ridge power, signal, maybe even old weather lines. They weren't trying to reach me specifically, but they were mapping how far control extended. Staying up here used to mean being above the problem. Now it means being at the edge of someone else's expanding solution. I lay back on the bunk in the dark and listened to the wind smear sound across the pass. If they push one more system uphill, I'll lose the choice to stay uninvolved. Elevation only buys safety while you're ignored. Tomorrow I either prepare to disappear farther along the ridge, or I accept that the valley's reach is climbing, and decide how close I'm willing to let it get before I move. The storm arrived without warning, the way mountain storms sometimes do, not with build-up, but with presence. One moment the clouds were a ceiling, the next they were inside the pass, flattening depth and swallowing distance. Sound collapsed inward. Wind stopped being directional and became pressure from everywhere at once. That kind of weather usually buys privacy. This time, it took it. I woke to the truck rocking slightly, not from gusts, but from uneven loading as snow accumulated faster on one side than the other. The hut creaked in short, sharp complaints. The kind that mean temperatures dropping faster than materials can follow. I pulled on boots and stepped outside long enough to knock weight off the roof and antenna mast, careful to work in bursts timed to the wind so the impacts blurred into background noise. Visibility dropped to nothing beyond 20 meters. The valley disappeared completely. Normally that would ease the tension. If you can't see lights, you can't chase them in your head. Instead, the lack of reference made everything feel closer. When systems go blind, they rely on touch and sound. So do people. The anemometer display blinked again around mid-morning. 2 quick refreshes this time, spaced evenly, then dead. That spacing wasn't environmental. It was clocked. Something downstream was polling, not continuously, but at intervals. Someone was checking reach. I shut the display off entirely after that. If the sensor couldn't lie convincingly, it didn't get to speak at all. Snow fell hard enough to erase my morning tracks within minutes. That gave me cover to do something I'd been avoiding. I walked to the ridge edge and looked downslope, where the access road disappears into trees. Through the storm, I caught movement. Dark shapes shifting where nothing should have been moving that steadily in that weather. Not the dead. Too purposeful. Too slow for vehicles. People climbing in short stages, stopping to rest, then moving again. They weren't coming for me yet. They were testing the climb the way you test a system. Apply load, see what fails. I retreated before the storm could thin enough to silhouette me. Back inside, I went through inventory with a colder eye. Fuel was good. Food would last if I stayed disciplined. Water was snow, infinite as long as I could melt quietly. What I didn't have was redundancy in place. If they reached the pass in numbers, the ridge would stop being empty. Empty is what keeps me safe. By afternoon, the storm intensified and then broke abruptly, leaving behind that brittle, ringing silence that follows heavy snow. The valley reappeared in pieces, its edges softened and unreadable. No lights, no smoke. That didn't mean work had stopped. It meant it had gone dark. At dusk, I heard the impacts again, closer this time. Faint, but unmistakable. Metal on ice. Pauses that matched human breathing, not terrain. They stopped below the final switchback again, as if marking a line they weren't ready to cross yet. That line is temporary. I spent the evening doing nothing visible, and everything internal. Mapping exit routes along the ridge where drifts scoured down to bare rock. Planning how far I could move without fuel if I had to abandon the truck. Calculating what sound the engine would make in this cold if I chose to use it once, decisively. The ridge is still a mistake to anyone looking up from below. Exposed. Unforgiving. But mistakes get corrected when someone decides they matter. Tonight, the valley stayed dark. Tomorrow will tell me whether that darkness is failure or preparation. The night didn't bring rest. It brought definition. Cold sharpened until every sound felt edged. Snow settled into a hard crust that rang when it shifted, carrying farther than powder ever does. I lay awake and tracked those micro-movements the way I used to track plow chatter through the wheel, listening for the difference between harmless vibration and something that means traction is about to go. Just before dawn, the impacts returned. Not below the switchback this time. On it. They were spaced wider now, more confident. Whoever was climbing had learned where the wind scoured the road clear enough to step without post-holing. That knowledge doesn't come from guessing. It comes from watching. From multiple attempts. From deciding the cost was worth paying. I didn't move. Moving would have outlined me against the thinning dark. The storm had left the valley under a clean inversion, cold pooled below like water in a bowl. Sound climbed strangely in that condition, flattened, then lifted. I could hear breath now. Not close, but closer than yesterday. Short exhales, paced. Someone managing exertion carefully. At 075 the valley flickered again. Same cluster as the night before, but longer, nearly a minute. Long enough to confirm stability under load. Long enough to power something more than a test lamp. That timing wasn't coincidence. You don't bring power online while people are climbing unless you're coordinating phases of a plan. I stayed inside the hut and watched the ridge shadow shorten across the snow through the single narrow window. The truck remained cold. I checked the exhaust one more time, palm numb against metal, confirming it was still dead. Starting it now would announce me not just to the climbers, but to whoever was watching the grid below. Mid-morning, the impact stopped. That's worse than them continuing. Stopping means arrival at a decision point. Either they'd turn back, or they'd reached a place where movement had to change. I took the binoculars out again and glassed the approach road. Through heat shimmer and glare, I caught a glimpse of motion tucked into the trees near the last bend. 3 shapes. 1 heavier, 2 lighter. They didn't advance. They watched. They weren't lost. They were assessing whether the ridge was worth occupying. I stayed low and let the hut look abandoned. Frost built evenly on the roof. No smoke, no movement. Just another piece of forgotten infrastructure clinging to a pass nobody uses anymore. The problem is that people who restore systems don't like forgotten infrastructure. Forgotten things can hide variables. By midday, the wind picked up just enough to smear sound again. I used that window to do something small but irreversible. I pulled the antenna mast down and laid it flat against the hut, securing it so it wouldn't rattle. Losing reception cost me information, but keeping it risks answering pings meant to map reach. Silence is better than partial truth. When the wind died again, the valley lights went out completely. No flicker this time. No smoke. That suggests consolidation below ground, not abandonment. They were done testing for now. Late afternoon, one of the figures moved. Just a few steps upslope, then stopped. A probe. I could have let it continue. I could have waited until they committed fully. Instead, I marked my own threshold. I broke skyline intentionally. Not fully, just enough. I stepped onto a wind-scoured rock where my outline would read as wrong against the ridge for a few seconds before I dropped back out of sight. No wave, no signal, just presence. The response was immediate. All 3 figures froze. One dropped lower, the heavier one shifted weight like they were shouldering something. Not a weapon, necessarily. Could have been binoculars. Could have been a pack. I didn't give them anything else to read. The message wasn't dominance. It was cost. Occupying this ridge means exposure, cold, and effort for someone who knows the terrain. It means dealing with a variable that doesn't sit still and doesn't announce itself cleanly. As the sun dipped, the figures retreated downslope. Not hurried, not casual. Deliberate withdrawal. That doesn't mean they're gone. It means they'll plan. I went back inside and sat in the dark, hands wrapped around nothing, feeling the cold seep in. The ridge still buys me separation, but now it's conditional. I've introduced myself as friction. Deterrence only works if it's expensive to overcome. Otherwise it just delays. I didn't sleep much after breaking Skyline. That kind of move sticks in the head, yours and theirs. I replayed the timing and angle, checking whether I'd given away more than I meant to. Silhouette duration was under 3 seconds. No reflective surfaces. No sound. Enough to be undeniable, not enough to be readable. If they were competent, they'd log it as a variable, not a target. If they weren't, they'd come back louder. Morning came clear and brutally cold. The storm had scrubbed the ridge down to bare ice in places, turning familiar paths into mirrors. Good for erasing tracks. Bad for moving fast. I took advantage of the clarity to glass the valley early. No lights. No smoke. Whatever work was happening below had gone quiet again, either because it was finished or because it had shifted phases. I focused on the approach road instead. No movement at first. Then, just after the sun hit the tree line, I saw a brief flash metal catching light where it shouldn't. Binoculars confirmed it wasn't ice. Someone was repositioning, testing sightlines the way I do. They weren't climbing yet. They were planning. That settled it. Staying here would mean escalation, not immediate, but inevitable. The ridge had gone from forgotten to evaluated. Evaluation is the step before occupation. I spent the late morning dismantling without erasing. Fuel drums were moved into shadow and partially buried in drift. The hut stayed intact, but I degraded it just enough to look abandoned. Loosened panels, a door left slightly out of square so it would moan in the wind. People avoid shelters that sound unreliable and cold. They don't trust them. The truck stayed. I drained the lines and pulled the battery. A vehicle that won't start reads as dead weight, not an asset. If they want it, they'll have to work for it, and work makes noise. By midday, the wind shifted along the ridge axis, giving me cover to move. I packed light food, tools, optics, nothing that rattled. I left behind anything that suggested permanence. No markers, no notes, no improvements. The ridge doesn't remember well if you don't give it reason to. I moved laterally, not down. Along a wind-scoured spine where snow never settles long enough to take a print. The cold cut hard, but movement kept blood going. I stopped often, not to rest, but to listen. Sound up here arrives early and leaves late. I wanted to catch any pursuit before it became proximity. None came. Mid-afternoon, I heard the impacts again, faint and distant. They'd resumed climbing, but slower, more cautious. My skyline break had worked as intended. It raised their estimate of cost. They weren't rushing. That meant I couldn't either. I put distance between myself and the hut until it disappeared into the geometry of the ridge. Once it was gone, something inside me loosened. Places carry weight. Leaving one behind lightens you even when the cold gets worse. As evening approached, clouds rolled in again, softening edges and flattening contrast. Perfect conditions for disappearance. I followed the ridge until it narrowed into a knife edge of rock and ice that no one would choose, unless they already knew it was viable. I knew it because I'd plowed beneath it for years, watching avalanches shear off everything else. I bedded down in a shallow cut that broke the wind and swallowed sound. No fire, no cooking, just insulation and stillness. From there, the valley was a suggestion, not a presence. I don't know if they'll take the hut. I don't know if they'll push power higher next week or abandon the valley altogether. What I know is that I've reset the equation. I'm no longer a fixed cost. They can amortize with planning. Tomorrow, I'll decide whether to keep moving along the ridge until it stops being useful, or drop down into terrain where elevation doesn't advertise itself. The ridge gave me time. Now it's asking me not to overstay. The night fracture the way thin ice does. Quiet at first, then with sharp spreading cracks you can't see. Wind came and went in bands, each one carrying sound differently. I learned quickly which gusts swallowed noise and which carried it clean along the spine. I only shifted position during the former, sliding my pack a few inches at a time so fabric never snapped taut. Cold set in deep. Not the biting kind that keeps you alert, but the flattening cold that steals urgency. I forced myself to move fingers and toes on a schedule, not when sensation told me to. Sensation lies when it starts to fail. Just before dawn, I heard movement where I didn't expect it, below and behind, far enough not to matter yet, close enough to log. The impacts were wrong for the approach road. Too irregular. Someone had left the planned route and was trying to parallel the ridge, probably to see if I'd gone laterally or dropped down. That told me they'd interpreted my disappearance correctly. They were no longer focused on the hut. They were tracking behavior. I didn't respond. Responding collapses distance. Letting them work keeps it expensive. As the light came up, the ridge revealed how little margin I'd chosen. The knife edge I'd followed narrowed further into broken fins of rock glazed with ice. Safe if you know where to put weight. Fatal if you hurry. I took it slow and accepted the loss of time. Time is cheaper than mistakes. Mid-morning brought the first real consequence of leaving the hut. Fuel. Without the truck, every calorie burned had to be justified. I stopped early, found a pocket where wind scoured down to bare stone, and melted snow using a chemical heat pack I'd been saving for injury. It was inefficient and irreversible, but dehydration erodes judgment faster than hunger. I logged the cost and moved on. Below, the valley stayed dark. No flicker. No smoke. That didn't reassure me. Silence after activity usually means consolidation or abandonment. Both free people up to look elsewhere. Around noon, I spotted them again. Two figures this time, spread wider, moving carefully along a lower parallel ridge. They'd split their effort, one likely holding position to watch while the other advanced. That's disciplined work. They weren't chasing blindly. I changed direction without changing pace, angling toward terrain that looks passable from a distance and isn't. The kind of slope that eats ankles and demands hands. Anyone following would have to commit fully before realizing the cost. Commitment is when people make noise. By afternoon, clouds rolled back in, flattening the world into shades of white and gray. The figures vanished into it. Either they'd stopped, or the weather had erased them. Both outcomes bought me room. I found shelter in a wind-carved notch just large enough to break outline and block sound from 3 directions. I stayed there longer than planned, letting my heat bleed into stone until the cold reclaimed it. No cooking, no light, just breathing slow and shallow. The ridge had stopped being a place and become a process movement. Pause, movement, pause. That's safer than belonging to any single spot. Still, the cost was accumulating. My leg burned with every step now. A reminder that distance up here compounds effort. If I keep moving along the ridge, I'll outrun attention eventually, but I'll also outrun resources, dropping down trades distance for concealment and access, but it puts me back in the reach of whatever is waking systems below. Tonight, I'll listen for one more cycle. If they keep probing laterally, I stay high and thin until the ridge runs out. If the valley wakes again, lights, sound, organized motion, I'll descend on my own terms while the weather still hides me. Elevation has kept me alive. It doesn't get to decide how long. Commitment came with the cold. Not a dramatic drop, just a steady tightening that told me the weather window was closing faster than I'd budgeted for. High ridges forgive indecision less than valleys do. Up here, you don't get to pause and think once the margin narrows. You act, or you get acted on by exposure. I chose to descend. Not straight down. Never straight down. I angled off the ridge into a broken drainage that cuts toward the tree line in a series of stepped shelves. From above, it looks like a dead end, too steep, too choked with rock to be useful. From inside it, sound dies quickly and sight lines collapse into short, ugly fragments. That's where mistakes hide. It's also where pursuit gets expensive. I waited for cloud to thicken before committing. When visibility dropped to a few dozen meters and the ridge lost its edge definition, I moved. Slow, deliberate. Every step tested before weight followed. Ice glazed the shelves unevenly, so I used the axe more like a probe than a tool, feeling for hollowness and fracture instead of chopping. The first 100 meters cost more energy than the last kilometer along the ridge. My leg complained immediately, the deep ache that warned me not to rush. I listened to it. Pain is data when you don't argue with it. Halfway down, I stopped and listened upslope. Nothing. No impacts. No shouted coordination. No sound of someone trying to keep eyes on a moving target in bad weather. Either they hadn't seen me commit, or they'd decided the descent wasn't worth matching in these conditions. Both outcomes were acceptable. Lower down, the cold changed again. Not warmer, denser. The air thickened as I crossed below the inversion layer, and sound behavior shifted with it. Noise stopped traveling clean and started folding back on itself. That meant proximity became harder to judge for anyone above me. Another layer of separation. I reached tree line near dusk. Trees are a different kind of shelter. They hide shape better than they hide heat, and they swallow sound unevenly. You trade early warning for confusion. After days of clean acoustics on the ridge, the messiness was disorienting at first. I slowed further, letting my ears recalibrate to near-field listening, branch snap, snowfall, breath too close to matter. I didn't go far into the trees, just enough that the ridge stopped being the dominant feature in my awareness. I found a stand of wind-thrown timber and bedded down on the downwind side, where trunks broke outline and blocked any straight approach. No fire, no cooking. I melted a small amount of snow using body heat and patience, letting it collect slowly in a bottle tucked inside my jacket. It took hours. That was fine. Time is cheaper down here. Through the night, I heard nothing from above. No impacts, no calls, no movement that suggested they'd followed the line I chose. Either they'd lost me in the weather, or they'd decided the ridge itself was no longer the priority. If the valley work resumed, their attention would be pulled downslope anyway. Just before sleep took me, I realized something that felt like relief and loss at the same time. The ridge had stopped being a shield the moment I treated it like one. Up there, I'd started thinking in terms of holding ground again. Deterrents, skyline breaks, thresholds. That's the same trap as the hut, just colder. Down here, movement becomes the default again. No single place matters enough to defend. Tomorrow, I'll move with the forest instead of against it. Follow drainages, animal paths, the quiet logic of terrain that's been avoiding attention long before I showed up. If the valley wakes fully, I won't be standing above it watching anymore. I'll already be somewhere it doesn't bother to look. Morning in the trees doesn't arrive cleanly. It seeps in through gaps and needles, turning the dark into something granular instead of lifting it away. I woke stiff and slow, leg angry but functional, breath fogging the inside of my jacket before I could stop it. That told me I'd lost more heat than planned overnight. Trees hide wind, not cold. I didn't move right away. First rule below the ridge is to let the forest tell you what it's doing before you add yourself to it. Snow had fallen lightly in the early hours. Not enough to bury tracks. Enough to soften them. Good and bad. Good because last night's movement was already blurring. Bad because anything new would write cleanly. I brushed the area where I'd slept with a branch before standing, scattering debris in a way that looked like wind drop instead of intent. Sound behavior was different down here. Close sounds mattered more than distant ones. I heard a jay somewhere upslope, irritated but not alarmed. No cascade of movement followed. That suggested no one else was moving through the trees nearby. Animals notice pressure long before people do. I angled downhill along the drainage, not following the water directly but paralleling it, where the ground stayed broken and awkward. Straight lines attract attention. So do comfortable paths. I stepped where it was inconvenient, letting fallen timber and rocks slow me on purpose. Slow movement disappears better than fast movement in a forest. By mid-morning the valley started making noise again. Not lights. Sound. A low, distant thrum that rose and fell irregularly. Engines, but not traffic. Generators or heavy equipment cycling under load. That told me the work below hadn't stopped. It had just gone quieter, more internal. The kind of activity that doesn't announce itself unless you know what to listen for. I adjusted course away from the sound without fully turning my back on it. Parallel movement lets you gauge change. If the noise grows, you know you're being pulled. If it fades, you know you're shedding attention. Water came easier down here. I found it in a trickle under a snow bridge, cold enough to numb fingers but clean enough to drink after a quick filter. I stayed longer than I should have, Not because I was tired, but because the place felt forgettable. Moss, shadow, no clear lines. The kind of spot you pass through without logging. That's dangerous thinking if you let it settle. I moved again before the comfort turned into planning. Around noon, I found signs of other movement for the first time since leaving the ridge. Old signs. A boot print half filled with snow, days old at least. Direction unclear. No pattern I could trust. That's fine. Knowing someone was here is less important than knowing whether they are here now. They weren't. The forest thickened as I descended, sound dampening further, sightlines collapsing into 10-meter decisions. That's where you rely on rhythm. Stop, listen, move, stop. I kept my pace irregular, sometimes waiting minutes between steps, sometimes moving continuously for a short burst. Predictability is what gets tracked. By late afternoon, the valley noise faded again. Either distance had increased or something had shut down. I didn't assume which. Assumptions create routes you don't realize you're following. I chose a shelter that didn't feel like shelter. A shallow depression between roots where cold air pooled and scent drained downhill. I lay where the ground was damp enough to wick heat, forcing me to stay alert. No fire, no cooking, just insulation and stillness. As darkness came on, I listened up slow one last time. Nothing from the ridge. Whatever interest I'd drawn up there had either stalled or redirected. That was the point of leaving when I did. Attention decays when it doesn't get rewarded with resolution. The forest doesn't protect you. It just complicates things enough that you can exist between decisions. Tomorrow I'll keep descending until the terrain changes again. Until forest gives way to something messier, more human, where decay has already erased expectations. The goal now isn't safety. It's being one more moving part in a system that's too busy failing to bother isolating me. The forest thinned the way exhaustion does, gradually, then all at once. One moment I was stepping through shadow and damp needles. The next I could see too far in too many directions. That's how you know you're crossing into old human ground. Trees give way not to open space, but to gaps where something used to insist on order. I slowed further. Below the tree line, the terrain stopped forgiving irregularity. Forest hides bad decisions by breaking lines, human leftovers to the opposite. Straight edges, right angles, hard surfaces. They amplify error. I adjusted my movement to match that reality, letting my pace flatten, my posture change. No more careful creeping. Careful looks wrong here. Tired looks normal. The first structure I encountered was a maintenance shed half collapsed under snow load. Roof bowed, door torn off its hinges, interior gutted by freeze and animals. I didn't go inside. Enclosures attract inspection. Instead I circled wide, watching how sound behaved around it. Wind pushed clean through the broken walls. Anything moving inside would advertise itself. That told me enough. Valley noise returned mid-morning, closer now. Not louder, clearer. I could separate sources. 2 generators cycling out of phase. 1 engine starting, failing, starting again. Human frustration has a sound to it if you've spent years listening to systems struggle back into tolerance. Someone was trying to make something work that didn't want to. I kept moving parallel, never straight toward it. Water was easier again, but riskier. Drainage here carried runoff from roads, yards, places that used to matter. I filtered longer and waited after drinking, letting my body tell me if I'd misjudged. It didn't. Luck or judgment. I don't pretend to know which. Around noon I crossed a road. Not a highway. A narrow county cut that once existed mostly to be plowed. I recognized the camber immediately, the way meltwater had always favored the inside edge. I almost smiled at that, then stopped myself. Recognition is a hook. The road was empty, but not unused. Tire tracks, days old, not many. Enough to mean someone had moved through and not bothered to erase it. That's either confidence or indifference. Both suggest numbers. I crossed at an angle where my steps overlapped the old tracks briefly, then diverged into brush. Mixing signatures makes reading harder. If someone looks, they'll argue about what they're seeing. By afternoon, fatigue sharpened into something dangerous. The leg burned constantly now, no longer flaring and settling, just there. That's the stage where people fall. I cut my planned distance in half and looked for a place to stop that wouldn't feel like a destination. I found it in a strip of dead ground behind an abandoned rest area, too exposed to be comfortable, too broken to be useful. Picnic tables collapsed, trash blown into drifts, concrete cracked and lifting. The kind of place people pass through without thinking twice. I stayed there because it was unpleasant. I melted snow in the open, letting the wind carry heat away instead of hiding it. Anyone watching would see nothing worth investigating, just cold and ruin doing what it does. As evening settled, the valley noise spiked once, then went quiet. Maybe something finally failed. Maybe it finally worked. Either way, the pattern changed. Patterns changing are more important than what they change into. I slept light, half in the open, half under a table that offered no real cover. Dreams came and went, all of them about straight lines filling with snow. Tomorrow I'll move again, deeper into the human mess, where nothing is clean enough to control for long. The ridge taught me distance. The forest taught me diffusion. What comes next will test whether moving through broken systems is enough, or whether I'll have to choose between joining one or breaking away entirely. The rest area didn't hold sleep so much as interrupted. Every time the wind shifted, debris scraped or tapped, and my body surfaced just long enough to check whether the sound was new or repeating. Repetition is what matters. Random noise fades. Patterns accumulate. By first light, the valley had changed tone again, not louder, busier. Short bursts of activity layered over one another without settling into rhythm. Doors opening and closing somewhere distant. A generator cycling too fast, then stalling. Human noise that hasn't decided what it's doing yet. That usually means more people have arrived than the system can support. I waited until the air warmed enough to loosen my joints, then moved. The leg slowed me down in a way I couldn't negotiate anymore. Not pain drag. I adjusted by shortening distance between stops and letting my upper body do less work. Down here, efficiency looks like fatigue. That's useful camouflage. People don't track the tired unless they have a reason. I skirted the edge of a low-density residential area without entering it, following the back line where yards dissolve into drainage and fencing collapses into suggestion. The dead were present, but scattered. They moved late and forgot quickly. I let them dictate my pauses. When they stopped, I stopped. When they drifted, I crossed. Mid-morning I heard voices close enough to separate cadence. 3, maybe 4. No urgency. Talking while moving. That's confidence, or at least the performance of it. I changed elevation slightly, down 10 meters, then back up. Enough to break line of travel without fully diverting. They passed without noticing me, still arguing about something mechanical. I recognized the tone. It was the same one I'd used for years on call-outs, problem framed as fixable, frustration kept just below the surface. That mindset is dangerous now. It pushes people to stay too long in places that are already failing. Food became the pressure point by early afternoon. I'd been stretching it, but stretch turns into starvation quietly. I had to choose between entering a structure or pushing on weak. Pushing weak is how you fall where someone else finds you. I entered a place that looked already argued with. A small hardware store off the county road, windows broken long ago, shelves collapsed inward, tools gone, no signs of recent sorting, just rot and weather. I stayed near the front where sound escaped easily and never went deeper than I could retreat in 2 steps. I took only what was loose and already ruined by moisture-packaged food past its date, but intact enough to matter. I didn't improve the mess. I didn't tidy. I made it worse. Leaving traces that suggest scarcity discourages return. Outside again, I sat with my back to concrete and ate slowly, watching the street for change. None came. The valley noise dipped and rose again somewhere out of sight, unfocused. That told me the people working the grid below were either losing control or spreading themselves too thin. Both create blind spots. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in low and flat, killing contrast, good for moving, bad for navigation. I used landmarks that didn't rely on visibility grade, wind direction, the way sound died in certain hollows. Those don't lie when eyes do. I chose my last shelter before dark the same way I'd chosen the others, by picking something no one would defend. A sagging carport behind a burned-out house, roof half collapsed, yard choked with weeds and scrap. Too open to feel safe, too degraded to matter. As night settled, I heard the siren again. Very distant. Short. Then nothing. It felt less like a signal this time and more like habit. A system trying to remember what it used to do. That's when systems are most fragile. I slept in short blocks and dreamed of snow blowing across lines painted on asphalt until you couldn't tell where anything was supposed to go. Tomorrow, I won't hedge anymore. Resources are low enough that movement has to serve an outcome, not just avoidance. I'll either move toward a place that can't be stabilized, or I'll move far enough away from the valley that whatever it becomes won't reach me in time. Either way, this record is nearly done. The decision isn't about safety now. It's about choosing which failures I'm willing to live near. This is the final part of the record. I woke with the decision already made, which is usually how the right ones arrive. No debate. No rehearsal. Just a quiet understanding that the window for staying undefined had closed. I moved away from the valley. Not straight out. Nothing is straight anymore. But on a line that bled elevation slowly and traded human density for terrain complexity. Old quarries, cut slopes, places where the ground had already been reworked beyond easy reuse. Infrastructure hates those places. So do people trying to restore it. The leg held as long as I respected its limits. I didn't push distance. I pushed consistency. Move, stop, listen. Drink when water appeared. Eat when hunger sharpened thought instead of blurring it. The dead thinned quickly as I put ground between myself and the noise attractors. Out here, they wandered without purpose, responding only to what was immediate. By midday, the valley noise faded into something abstract, no longer directional, just a memory of activity. I stopped checking it. When you keep checking behind you, you keep orienting yourself to what you're leaving. That's how people drift back into trouble. I crossed into land that never wanted to be settled in the first place. Wind-cut benches. Scrub that grows just enough to hide but not enough to harvest. No clean water sources but many small ones. No structures worth fixing. The kind of place responders only visit when something has already gone wrong. That's why it works now. I rested in the open where there was nothing to improve and nothing to defend. I let the cold take heat because it would give it back slowly if I stayed patient. I watched the sky instead of the ground. No smoke, no flicker, no organized movement. The ridge was no longer visible from here. That surprised me more than it should have. It had felt permanent while I was on it. Everything does when you're using it to delay decisions. I won't go back. The valley will do what valleys do, attract effort until it collapses under it or stabilizes into something loud and dangerous. Either outcome draws attention. Attention creates gradients. Gradients pull people uphill again, toward places that look like solutions. I don't need to be part of that cycle. My work used to be about keeping roads open through weather that didn't care. That taught me something I ignored for too long. You don't beat storms by standing in front of them. You beat them by not being where they're strongest when they arrive. I'll keep moving at the edge of systems, not inside them. I'll take from places that don't remember being taken from, and leave before my presence accumulates into a problem someone wants to solve. This record ends here because the framework is complete. Elevation bought time. Distance bought space. Motion bought invisibility. Holding ground bought nothing but attention. If I survive longer, it won't be because I found a perfect place. It will be because I kept choosing to leave before any place could decide I belonged to it.